Welcome back. This is part 3 of my CSS crash course. Now, like I said in the last video, this was originally intended to be just one large video, but it got a little bit long and I wanted to break it up just a little bit. So in this video, we're going to be talking about some of the most common CSS properties that you might find yourself using. We're going to jump through a variety of different categories, so fonts, backgrounds, and some layouts and stuff like that. So it's not meant to be super comprehensive of absolutely everything that you'll see, but it will get us prepared for the code challenges that we're going to work on over the next couple of videos. And one more thing before we jump in, this is part of my Full Stack Web Developer Roadmap series, where you go from complete beginner to deploying your first full stack web app. And you can check out more with this video in the top right corner. Also links in the description. Alright, without further ado, let's jump into the most common CSS properties that you might use. Aside from the display property and the box sizing and a couple other things we just talked about, there's one other CSS property that you'll use pretty often, and it will affect the flow of the elements on the page. And that's going to be the position property. So this position property has, I think, about 4 or 5 different possibilities. So let's go ahead and write those out. We need to make an unordered list and then put some list items in. Let me get my notes here. So we can have a value of static. We can have a value of absolute. We can have a value of relative. And then we can have fixed. And the last one is going to be sticky. So when I'm talking about this position property, all I'm saying is that if we came down and targeted this unordered list, and then we gave it a position, we can say we want it to be fixed. But what does this actually mean? Well, this position property is going to be really handy when we have to lay out things on the page and make things like navbars. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and show you is an example of how we might make a navbar and show how that will stay at the top of the page rather than scrolling down when we have content that exceeds the total height of the viewport or the web page that we're looking at. A few notes I want to make. This first one, the static, is going to be the default value. So if we came down here and defined the position of this unordered list to be static, that's kind of redundant because it's already going to be that by default. And then the other note I want to make is the sticky property value is going to be a little bit newer. It's unsupported in some browsers, and I'm not really going to touch on it because we can achieve very similar things with this fixed property. All right, so those are the possible values. Let's walk through each of them and see what they actually do for our HTML. So the first thing I want to do is create a nav element. So we talked about semantic HTML in the prior lesson, how we want to use what the intent of that element is. And if we want to make a navbar, we should use the nav HTML tag. So within that nav, we can make some sort of list, which would be kind of a list of different links or something. But just to keep it simple, I'm just going to put in some sort of heading. So we'll just put in an h2 element, and we'll say this is the navbar. So you're going to see that pop up on the page, and it's nothing special at the moment. And actually, let's go ahead. Let's make this an h4 just to be a little bit smaller. And what we want to do in the CSS is we want to target that nav element. We want to give it a background color of blue. We're going to talk about those background styling properties, so bear with me here while we don't know about them. And then I want to make the height of this equal to, we'll call it 60 pixels. So you can see we have some sort of nav bar sitting up on the page. And I actually don't like this blue. Let's go ahead and do navy and then change the color of the text to white just to make it look a little bit better. And what you'll see is there's some space going on around this. We would, ideally want this to be at the top of the page, have no white space around it. And that's happening for 2 reasons. By default, this h4 element is going to have some sort of margin around it. It's just a browser default that is set on this element. We didn't set it, but it's already there. Likewise, CodePen has a default that puts some either margin or padding within the body element. So anything that we write in this HTML is going to have a little bit of padding in there so that, we have this white space. So all we have to do is just cancel that out by writing a CSS rule. So we'll start with H4, and we'll just say we want 0 margin on there, see what that does. Remove some of the margin. And then we want to come down and say on the body, we want to have 0 margin. I guess that's all we needed. We just need to zero out the margin, and now there's no space around this. So looking good there. And if we wanted to center this text within the navbar, we can use a little trick. We can use the line height property to basically say, okay, I want this text to be, X amount of pixels tall. And in this case, we know exactly how tall the navbar is, 60 pixels. So what we need to do with this H4 is make the line height equal to 60 pixels. And now we're going to see that go right in the middle. And the last thing we'll do is on the left side of that H4 element, let's just put some padding on the left of, say, 10 pixels, and that's going to push it out a little bit. So I know we haven't talked about a lot of these properties. We will in a second, but you can see how this navbar is coming together. But the problem is right now, if we were to scroll down on this page, the navbar is going to kind of go away, and we don't want that. Since there's no other elements, when I scroll, you're not going to see anything. So let's go ahead and add a div that has a bunch of boxes in here. So we'll say we want a div with a class of box, and then let's replicate that several times down. And then we'll come down here and style all the classes of box. And what we're going to do is we're going to give it a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And let's go ahead and give it a background color of, green is fine for now. You're going to see just one big blob because they're all kind of smushed together. But all we have to do is add some margin around it, and those are going to be separated out. So the reason that I created those is just to give us more than enough content so that we can actually see some scrolling action. So now you'll see the scroll bar here on the right because we've got too much content for the visible screen. And when we scroll down, what happens? We're not going to see that nav bar anymore. And as you're probably used to with most sites, the nav bar needs to stay up top. And the way that we do that is by using the position property. And we can just come into the nav bar right here, and we can say that we want the position to be fixed. And what that's going to do is a lot of things that we don't expect, and it's going to look a little bit intimidating for a second until we figure out exactly what's going on. So when we put it to fixed, it actually takes that element out of the flow of the HTML document. So previously we talked about how we have block elements and inline elements, and if we change those, it kind of breaks them out of the flow of the content. Likewise with the position fixed property, now what's going to happen is we have to explicitly set the width of this. So let's go ahead and set the width to be 100% of its container, and that should span it across the entire web page here. Another way that we could do that is a property called 100 viewport width, so VW. And that is actually the same thing. If we just let's come over to our dev tools in Firefox, and if you remember, we could say window.inner height and get some sort of value here. And this means that the height of the visible window here is 966 pixels. We can also get the inner width right here, which is 773. And if we were to change this right here and run it again, it's going to be a different value because the visible width of this viewport changed. So these properties, we know how to get them in JavaScript through the DOM, but we can also get them within CSS by using either 100 viewport width or 100 viewport height, so VH. So that is just a really useful thing to know. I use it all the time, especially when I'm making full page layouts and nav bars and stuff like that. Now the last thing about a position fixed element is that you have to specify the offset that you have to its parent container. Now in this case, the parent container of our nav is going to be the body element, and that's going to be basically this visible screen right here. So all we have to do is come down and say, from the top, I want it to be 0 pixels. And that's going to pull it up to the top, and then since we have it as 100% or 100% width, we don't really need to define this other one, but let's go ahead and say we want it to be 0 pixels from the left. So at this point, what we can see is that as we scroll down, our nav bar stays at the top, and it's considered fixed positioning. The last thing that we would probably want to do is address this issue right here. Our boxes or our main content has now spilled under our fixed nav bar. And the reason is because this fixed nav bar doesn't take up any space. So unlike a block element or even an inline element that takes up some sort of space, to the HTML document, this nav bar occupies 0 space whatsoever. So to make sure that the main content is below it at all times, we have to give a margin on the top of this boxes div class. So we come down to the CSS, give it target that class, and then we say we want to give the margin top probably should be a little more than 60 pixels. So let's just go ahead and say 80 pixels, and that should bring all of our boxes down, and now it's working just fine. So that is the fixed positioning, and it's going to be really useful when you're trying to make a nav bar at the top, even at the side, on the right side, or even a footer at the bottom of the page. That's a really good use case for this. The last couple position property values that we can use, so absolute and relative positioning. Again, we're not talking about static because that's the default, and sticky because that's kind of out of the scope here. But when we're talking about a fixed positioning, what we just looked at, that's going to set the element, it's going to remove it from the flow of the document and take up 0 space, and it's going to be positioned relative to the viewport, which is always going to be the edges of the browser window. So as you saw, we said we want it to be 0 pixels from the top, so at the very top of the viewport, and 0 pixels from the left, so the very left of the viewport. Now, with relative and absolute positioning, it's somewhat similar. We're still pulling things out of the flow, or at least with absolute positioning, we're pulling them out of the flow of the document, but we're positioning them relative to other elements. So let's play around with relative positioning first. So let me target this first box right here. And what I want to do is I want to give it another class called rel position, just to give it some indication of what it's doing. And then within this, I want to make another div, and I want to say this will be absolute position. We're not going to do anything quite yet with that, but I'll show you what it does in just a second. So let's focus in on this relatively positioned box, which is this first green box that we're targeting. We'll come down into our CSS, and all we're going to do is give this relative position class a relative position. And what you're going to see here is nothing has happened yet, but what happens when we scroll is now this first box goes on top of our nav bar. So only the first box though, the rest of them go behind it. And that is a direct result of setting that relative positioning on the element. Because what that does, like I said, with a lot of CSS properties, setting one value will kind of change the rules of the game. It's no different here. What this does is enables a new property called z-index, which basically says, okay, we've got all these elements on the page. What is the z-index, three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional? So which one sits on top of another? And when you put relative positioning or absolute positioning on an element, it now has the z-index. So now what we have to do is define what needs to be on top of another. So we need to come up to the nav bar and give it a z-index of 1 to put it on top of this element once again. So that's something really important to know about the relative positioning. But what relative positioning really does is it, as you saw, it didn't really change the actual position of that box. But now what we can do is define these top, left, right, and bottom properties on this element, and it will change its position relative to itself. So that's kind of a a confusing topic, but basically the way you can think of it is if that green box is sitting right there right now, if we give it a top value and we say 20 pixels, it's going to go down 20 pixels. And confusingly enough, since I believe our margin was 20 pixels exactly, it's going to blend it into the other boxes. So let's go ahead and make this 10 so that we see some separation still. But it basically takes the original position, and if we add the top property, it will go 10 pixels below where it was to begin with. So it's a little bit confusing, but it is a useful type of positioning, especially when you have some stubborn elements in your HTML that you just need to get to move just a little bit, but you can't quite do it with normal CSS properties. And finally, if you set the position to relative on a parent element, then you can set absolute positioning on the element within that parent element. So what we can do is we can look at this div that we put within the relatively positioned div, and we can take this class and target it with our CSS. So we'll target the absolutely positioned element, which is not showing up yet, but let's go ahead and give it a width of 20 pixels and a height of 20 pixels, and give it a background color of, say, orange. So we're going to have all sorts of nasty colors here on the screen. And what you'll see is that by default, it's going to sit up there in the top left corner of its parent. And that's because we haven't positioned it yet. So let's give it the absolute positioning. And what that's going to do is now we have those top, bottom, right, and left offsets enabled on this specific element, but instead of being an offset based on the viewport, so with this fixed navbar, whatever we pass to those properties is going to be in relation to the edges of your viewport. Now we're going to be setting these top, right, bottom, left offsets based on the position of the next highest element that has relative or absolute positioning. And if there's nothing above it that has those positionings, then it's going to use the HTML element or the root element. So in this case, we have something that is relatively positioned as the direct parent, which is this green box. So if we were to come down to the absolute position and say we want to put it 20 pixels from the top, it's just moving it down 20 pixels relative to the edges of this parent container. And then we can put it, I don't know, we can say from the right we want it to be 30 pixels. So it's going to pull it over to the right and offset it 30 pixels off of that right edge. So that's what the absolute positioning does, and it has to be used in relation with that relative positioning. Once again, if you don't have a parent element that is relatively positioned, so let's go ahead and remove this position relative, and now it completely disappears. And you probably are asking yourself, where did this just go? And the answer is I'm thinking it's probably behind the navbar. So let's go ahead and give it a z-index of 2, which is greater than the navbar, which has an index of 1. And now you can see it pop up here in the navbar. And the reason it's up there is because since we don't have any relatively positioned elements as its parent or grandparent, it's positioning itself relative to the viewport, just like we saw with the fixed positioning. So now what we can say, if we look at this absolutely positioned element, if we change the top to be 0 and the right to be also 0, it's going to be perfectly up in the top right corner, as you can see here on the screen. As you can see, these position properties can really help you control where the elements sit on the page, and they're really powerful layout properties. Obviously, you're not going to be a master of them after just watching this brief tutorial or demo, but hopefully it exposed you to what's possible, and when you stumble upon it in the future or in the code challenges, you'll know exactly what's going on. If I'm being honest, we've made it through the hardest part of CSS in the first part of this course. The remainder of this video and this crash course is going to be a little bit more fun, a little bit more straightforward, and you're going to really start to see the magic of CSS coming into play. So in the remainder, we're going to talk a little bit about CSS units. So we've looked at them already, but pixels, EM, rem units, percentages, maybe a couple others. Actually, that's probably it. And then we're also going to look at color codes and different color stylings. So we've been using the color property to change the text color throughout this tutorial, but we're going to get into, how do we define different colors and, how do we do color themes and stuff like that. And then we'll dig into font properties. So how do we change the font that's on the page and different font families and import fonts and stuff like that. And then finally, we will talk about background properties. So how do we make an image as the background of your web page? And then at the end, I'm going to talk about writing shorthand CSS. So that's going to bring a few things together that you may catch on to as we write it, but that'll be pretty interesting. And then to cap it off, I'm going to give you my kind of 4-step system of how I think through putting together HTML and then styling that with CSS effectively. So it's basically like get the layout first, then put the styles on and iterate over that process. Before we get into the remainder of the CSS properties, some common ones you'll use, we have to talk about measurement units within CSS. So you can see them on the screen here. Pixels, pretty straightforward and common. EM and rem, those are font units, like measuring how large the font on the screen is. And then percentages, that's going to really play into some responsive design that we'll talk about in a later video. So we'll start with pixels, and you probably already looked it up, seen me using it. It's relatively intuitive, but your computer screen is made up of pixels. And the higher resolution your computer screen is, the more pixels you can cram into it. So it gets into a pretty complex discussion when you actually start thinking about it too much when you're looking at a web page and trying to calculate how many pixels exist on that web page. But if you just look at it as a way to explicitly set the dimensions of HTML elements, it's pretty simple. So for example, you saw that we made this little orange box in the top right corner. We set it equal to a width and height of 20 pixels. So that's obviously somewhat small. And something that I wondered when I was first starting out is how do I get a good grasp of how many pixels to assign to certain types of elements? And it's kind of like riding a bike. Like as you go through and write more and more CSS, you'll get a feel for what are kind of the average pixel units that you'll be assigning to different types of things. So for example, I know that whenever I set padding or margin, it's usually going to be in the range of 10 to 20 pixels. When I set a border radius, it's going to be in the range of 4 to 7 pixels, and so on and so forth. You kind of get a feel for how large a pixel is after you've written CSS for a while. Next up, I'm going to skip down away from those font units, so talking about EM and rem. I'm going to skip those for a second and talk about percentages. Now, percentages are kind of the preferred way in a lot of cases to define the width and height of certain elements on the page, because when you go from a desktop to a mobile device, you're going to need relative dimensions rather than just saying, oh, I want this element to be 500 pixels. So a good example of this, let me just take what I've got here on the screen, and I'll go ahead and restyle this first box. So it's the relatively positioned box. I'll leave it how it is, and I'm just going to say that I want the width to be 600 pixels. And what it's going to do is it's going to be wider now. And the problem here is that when I resize this screen and we go to a mobile device, it's going to get cut off. So as I make this smaller and smaller, you're going to see that that box just goes off the screen completely. And the problem with that is, you want to have responsive designs. So a better way to do this is to say, I want the width to be, I don't know, we'll call it 80% of the container. So as we resize this, you're going to see that that always stays 80% of the container that it's within. And that's a great way to write responsive web pages. And again, we're going to be talking a lot more about that responsive design in a separate video. but that's why percentages matter in the first place. Now, something about percentages that can get a little bit confusing is it's all relative to its container. So let's go ahead and apply a few concepts we've learned. So the question is, how do we get this little orange box back in the green box so that we can play around with this? Well, all we have to do is set the position back to relative. So this orange box is going to now be relative to the green box. So when I uncomment this property right here, it's going to put this orange box in the top right corner of the green box. So, or at least I think that's what's going to happen. And that's exactly what happened. So we now have that there. And now what I'm going to do is go ahead and reposition this. So instead of being in the top right, we're going to put it in the top left. So we'll put it in the top left. And now what we're going to do is give it a width in terms of percentages rather than pixels. So what happens if I give it a width of 100%? Well, now it spans the entire width of its parent element, not the entire web page, because it exists within that parent element, so it's going to occupy the width of the parent element. In other words, if we were to set, I'm just going to do this to make the math a little bit more simple, but let's go ahead and set this green box equal to, say, 500 pixels. So the calculation for this orange element is going to be 500 pixels times 100% is equal to 500 pixels. And if we were to change this positioning to call it 80%, now it's going to be 80% of 500, which is, I guess, 400 pixels? Yeah, about 400 pixels is what this is now. So you can see it's relative to its container, not relative to the entire web page when we define percentages. We've talked about pixels and percentages. Now let's talk about EM and rem units. So these are specific to font sizes, and we haven't really talked about fonts yet, but we have looked at text on the screen. So why don't I go ahead and put some text within our absolutely positioned div. So now we've got some text here, and we can change the size of that text using the font size property. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but if we came down into our absolutely positioned element and we give it a font size, we can say it can be 16 pixels, which is generally the standard font size of a paragraph element. So you won't see it change because that's probably the default that it already is. But if we went and changed that to, say, 18 pixels, you'll see that the text gets a little bit larger. Now, when we're talking about EM and rem units, that's kind of the more preferred way to define text sizes within a web page. And the reason being is if you're going around hunting and pecking for, trying to find all of the different CSS rules that you've defined font sizes in, it gets pretty difficult. You want to define it at one level, so at the top level of the document, and then everything else needs to be relative to that assignment. So what you'll generally see with font sizes is you'll see the HTML element. So if we target the root element itself and we give it a font size, you'll generally see it be set to about 16 pixels. From there, you will then define elements below that root element in relation to that 16 pixels. So if I came down to the absolute positioned element, so this text right here, and I said that I want the font size to be 1 rem. That means that it's going to be 100% of the size of the text in the root element, or rem. So in this case, the root element is HTML, and the font size is 16. So if we define it as 1 rem, then that means that we're doing 100% of 16 pixels, or in other words, 16 pixels. And if we change this to, say, 1.2 rem, that would be 120% of 16 pixels, which I don't think I can do that in my head right now. So you figure that out with the calculator on your own, but basically it makes it larger than the default font size. Likewise, we can also use EM units, and that basically means relative to its parent element. So if we have this relatively positioned element, which is the green box right here, and we set the font size right here to 16, or no, we'll go ahead and say something a lot larger so that we can distinguish this. So the relatively positioned element's going to have a font size of 24 pixels. And then if we came down and we said we want 1 EM in the child element, it's going to set it exactly equal to this 24 pixels. But if we change this back to rem units, now it's going to go back to the 16 pixels because now it's relative to the HTML declaration, which at the top is a font size of 16 pixels. So as you can see, the benefit of doing this and using these EM and rem units is you can define it one time and then everything else is relative to that. So let's say that you have your web app and you would originally define it to 14 pixels, and then you start using the app and your users start complaining, oh, everything's too small. Instead of going and changing every CSS rule, all you have to do is go up to the root element, change that, and then everything else is relative to that. So that would be the benefit of using EM and rem units. Speaking of fonts, let's go ahead and see how we can set custom fonts on our HTML. So I'm going to get rid of all this because all these colors are driving me nuts. They're just so ugly. I can't deal with them anymore. So let's get a clean slate. So let's go ahead and put a heading element and some paragraph text, and then maybe one more. We'll call this the original style text. And what we'll do here is this will be the original ID, and what we're going to style this as is we'll put these two as a new font style, and then we'll keep this one as the original just as a reference point. When we're dealing with fonts, in my head at least, there's about 4 properties that are highly relevant that you have to know. The first font property that we're dealing with is the font family, which is going to define what all of the text on your web page, in your web app, what that's going to inherit. And especially if you define it on the body or even the HTML, so the whole document, you can define the font family, and that's going to apply to everything within the document. Unless something is, of course, overwritten with a font family on a more specific element. But let's go to the documentation. I just searched for the font family property. You could also go to Technologies, CSS, Reference, come down to the index, and then somewhere in the F here we can find the font family. Looks like it might be at the very bottom though. Okay, so here's the font family, so that's how you get there. And as you can see, we are giving 2 values to this, or you don't have to, but in most cases you're going to give 2 values to this. The first one is going to be the font family that you're wanting to specify. And there's a bunch of built-in font families that you can use. Let me just see what we can find. Default font families. There's probably a resource. I think this is the one I clicked on before. So w3.org, it looks like this defines a lot of those default families that are available in all your browsers. So this first one is going to represent the family, and then the second one, or the second argument, we'll call it, to this property is going to be the fallback font. So there's only a couple of valid fallback fonts, and they're literally just like the type of font. So everyone knows like a serif and a sans serif font, and then like there's a monospace font, which is more like a typewriter type thing. So those will be fallbacks for if the browser doesn't support the first one that you define. But let's just go ahead and look at an example. In most cases, you're just going to put them in quotes, that first one, because it'll be 2 words. So let's copy this one in. That's a good example. So we'll put that in there, and you'll see how this changes. And I can comment it out. You'll see it change, and then uncomment it, and you'll see the change of this font. Now the question is, what happens if we want something more custom? What if we want like a really nice looking professional font? Well, there's a couple ways that you can do this in CSS, and a couple of them I'm not going to walk through. But the easiest way is to go to Google Fonts. So let's open up Google Fonts and go here, and then from from this page, we can search through all different categories of fonts. So let's say that we want only serif fonts. And then we can go down to, I guess different languages that they're available in and different font properties. So let's scroll down and just pick something. See if I can find one that might be a little bit popular. I believe you can sort by trending or most popular. So maybe we look at Roboto Slab. All right, so that's a good one. And from here, you just go down to all of these different font weights and styles, and you click select this style. So in pretty much every case, you're going to select the regular. So we'll click select that style. And what you'll notice is that in this link that we're going to use in just a second, it looks like it's just pulling in a default link, but the second we add in a different weight, so let's say that we want the boldest version of this font, and we click select style, now you're going to see that there's this little parameter in here that defines that we want the weight of 400 and 900. And each additional weight that you add is going to add a little bit more size to this import, so you have to be careful with that, but for the most part, grab a couple and you should be good. So in this case, we have a regular font and we have a very bold font. And all we have to do is take this link tag, which is a valid HTML tag that we had talked about earlier, and that's actually how you import style sheets to an HTML document. And we'll come back to our CodePen playground and come up to settings, I believe HTML, and then in this section here, stuff for the head, we can just paste in those link tags. And now those fonts have been imported into our document and we can access them with CSS. Now, this is a little bit different than how you would do it if you were writing outside of the CodePen environment. So just for a second, I'm going to comment out all of this HTML and show you exactly how you would do this on your own. So you're going to need an HTML, a body, and then, of course, the head. So this is our basic structure of an HTML document. And then you'll, of course, have a link to your styles.css or something like that. So this will be representing your style sheet. Not here, but in a different document it would. And then you can also copy in those link tags that we imported from Google Fonts. So this is how you would basically import a font to a custom HTML document that's outside of this, nicely programmed CodePen environment. So anyways, let's get rid of that. We don't need that. We'll uncomment or not uncomment. Okay, so we're back to the start, and now all we have to do is replace these two lines with the imported font. If you go back to Roboto Slab, you're going to see that the CSS rules to specify this family is right here. So we can just copy that, come back here, and replace this whole line, and now you'll watch the text change to this new font. So that's how you would import a custom font. It's pretty much how I always do it for a lot of my web pages and apps, is use Google Fonts. It's free and very easy to use. So that is the first and most important CSS property when we're dealing with fonts. We'll go ahead and give a font size of 16 pixels because we're on the root HTML element, and that is a very standard value to be giving an entire web page. Now, what gets interesting is the font weight property. So font weight determines the thickness of that font, but the interesting thing about this one is you can only use the weights that you've imported if you're using something like Google Fonts. So if you remember when we were looking at this, we only imported a weight of 400 and 900, which means if we give, let's go ahead and target a specific element. So in this case, let's say this will be thick font, and target that by its ID, and then give it a font weight of 900. And you're going to see that this goes bold because we're specifying it to be 900. But since we only imported that one weight, if we change this to say, 700, it's not going to change anything on the page. And the reason is we didn't import it. But if we were to change this back down to 400, then it's going to go back to normal because we did import the 400 or regular font size. So that's how the font weight property is related to those imports that you will do. The last thing we'll talk about is line height. So let me put in a paragraph tag, and here let's go ahead and copy some lorem ipsum font, which is basically just generic text that we can use. And what you'll see on the page is very normal looking text. Now if we change the line height, so if we target the paragraph elements and give it a line height of, call it 30 pixels, you're going to see that it spaces this out a little bit more than the original. And I believe the default line height is going to be the same as the font size, but I could be wrong on that. I would have to check. But basically, let's see. We can actually check that. So we'll go 1 rem. And it looks like, no, it's not the same as the font size because it definitely got smushed a little bit more. But anyways, line height is basically going to give you the space between the lines of text when there's multiple lines of text. We are getting to the end here, but we have a couple more topics to cover, and one of those is colors. So there's not a whole lot to know about colors, but I do want to walk through some of the basics. So far, we've been talking about just basic, colors. So if we came into our paragraph element here, we give it a color of, say, red. Now, red is pretty easy to understand. It's the color red. But that is a built-in CSS property, and I'm wondering if there's a resource that has all of those potential properties. So if you go to the MDN documentation, go to the color property, so the color CSS property, and then I believe there should be some sort of list of all of the possible colors that you can use. Let's see if we can find it here. So it looks like here's a few of the color keywords that you can use. This looks like a list. I don't know if this is exhaustive of all of the possible ones, but it sure looks like it. So you can just go to color value is where that is on the documentation. But that's what we've been looking at so far. And there are also other ways that you can define colors. So you can define it as a hex or hexadecimal. You can define it as RGB, or you can define it as rgba. So we'll walk through all of these and I'll show you exactly what they do. To help us out a little bit, we're going to use this built-in color picker. Just type in RGB to hex or vice versa, and usually comes up on Google. There's other tools that you can use as well. Let me zoom in so that we can really see what we're dealing with here. And you'll see that in this color picker, we can drag to look for different colors. We'll just stop here on this green. And what you'll see is all these different codes. So we could just type into our CSS, we could just say we want green, or we want something like light green. Those are both valid values. But if we wanted to be more specific and go with a color theme, we're going to have to use something a little bit more complex. And these color codes allow us to get to a very finite amount of detail with our colors. And what you need to understand is that each color is built with red, green, and blue, which is defined by this RGB value. So the first number is going to be red, then green, and then blue. Now these numbers go from 0 to 255. I believe that's 1 byte. Is how much space that takes up in memory, and each different combination of those byte values are going to give you a different color based on the blending of those red, green, and blue values. And if you were to take these three values and convert them to hexadecimal notation, which is just a numbering system, you get this code right here. So the 128 would be represented by 80 in hexadecimal. 235 would be represented by E and B in hexadecimal, and 52, just drag something around there, 52 will be represented by 34 in hexadecimal. So these are the same exact thing, just expressed with different notation. Now there's one other thing that we can do, and that is add an RGBA value. So let's go ahead and copy this hex code in. So we'll copy that into our our color for text color. And you'll see that it changed a little bit. And that works. We can also come back and grab the RGB values. And then in our CSS, all we need to do is type RGB, put some parentheses, and separate those values from 0 to 255 by commas. Now there's one trick that you can use. If you add an A at the end of the RGB, you can define one more value within this, I guess, array or whatever we're calling this. And this represents the opacity that we're going to define. So if we wanted 100% opacity, basically the same color, we give it 1. And that's going to give us the same color. But if we wanted 50% opacity, you give it 0.5. And you can see how this has been kind of grayed out. We can actually use our new skills of absolutely positioning an element. Let's go ahead and write a div in here, and we'll say overlay, and come down and style this. So we'll say overlay is going to be a width of 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and then we're going to give it the same exact color right here. So, and then maybe the P color will just be black by default so that we can see it really well. And then this overlay is not showing up. And why is it not showing up? Hold on. Oh, that is because we've set the color. We need to set the background color to actually get something to show up. Now, this is not over the text yet, but all we have to do is say position absolute, and then give it 0 from the top, and there we go. So we've now got this box sitting on top of this text, and you can see that we can actually see the text through it because we've given it this 50% opacity value. If we flip that to 1, it's going to disappear because it's 100% opacity and it's covering all of the text. So that's what the RGBA CSS value is able to do with colors. Now, speaking of colors, I recommend going to Adobe Color, which is a great place to kind of explore different color themes, and it will show you like all of the different complementary colors to certain codes. And you can even go to Explore or go to Trends, and you can look through different color themes that people have put together for different niches. So graphic design, illustration, architecture, game design. And you can go in and click on these palettes, and it will give you all of the hex codes that you need. And you can set those up in your global CSS values, and then your whole web page is going to be themed in a uniform way. All right, let's get rid of all this stuff because we are ready for the, I think the last category of CSS properties that you'll probably need to be aware of, and that is background properties. So far, we have talked about background colors, and you've seen me do this with these boxes where I'm just giving them background colors so that we can see them on the screen. But you can also do background images, and with background images there are a couple of properties, just like we talked about before. Certain properties set to certain values kind of change the rules of the game for the rest of the page, and that is the same deal with background images. So I'm going to walk you through a couple use cases with backgrounds and how you might see them, in real life when you actually start putting together web pages. The first one is simple. Like I said, we've already talked about it, and let me just go ahead and make some simple text on the page just so we have something. But what we're going to target is the body element. So that's the whole web page. And I'm going to give the body element a background color of green. And you're going to see on the screen that it turns completely green. So that is the easiest property. The next thing that you can do, rather than just making a solid color background, is you can put a background image on your web page. It's actually pretty common for like a home page. Here's my golf website. You'll see that there's a background image there. And this background image, I've actually pulled this out into its own link so that we can use it within the CodePen environment. So let's copy this link so that we have it ready. And now what I'm going to do is put a div up here, and we're going to call it the main content. And then we're going to put the text in there just so that we have something to see. And from here, we will grab the main content, and we're going to say background, rather than background color equal to something like blue, we're going to say the background image is equal to a URL. And I guess I copied in the wrong thing here. So let me grab that link again. And now we have a URL. So the problem here is it's only taking up this small amount of space. And that is because we have not defined the size of this main content. So all we need to do is say the width of the content is going to be 100% of the viewport width. So again, that's the whole visible screen is 100% of that width. And what you'll see is there's still some gaps here, and that's because the CodePen environment automatically adds some margin around the body. So what we need to do there is reset that. So we'll go to the body and give it a margin of 0. So that should bring it in line there. And then we have this P element, which has some sort of margin on it too, which is adding this top margin. So we'll make the P margin equal to 0 as well. And now we have this at the top of the screen. So if we come down here and give it a height of 100% of the viewport height, now we're going to see this image across the whole page. Now, obviously this image is not showing what it is. Like this is, who knows what this image is, and we need to position it a little bit differently. So the way that we do that is we'll use a property called background size, and we'll go ahead and set that equal to cover. So that's going to cover the whole container that we have it as a background for. And then we want to make sure that we specify the background repeat to be no repeat, just in case a screen size is so big that it has to repeat. And then finally, I think we need to add in the background position, which is going to take two values. It's going to say, I think you can just say like bottom right or something like that. So let's go ahead and look that up. If we go to the documentation and type in background position, so it says the background position sets the initial position for each background image. It's relative to the position layer. Okay, and you can see that there's multiple different values that you can give it. You can give it values relative to different parts of the screen, or you can just say position it at the top, left, or center, that kind of thing. So what I will do is just position it to the right. Bottom right works, but we can just position it to the right because our golfer here is on the right side and we need to pull it over so that you can see him in the background. So this is our basic background image, and then from here you can put text on the screen. So what if we went up here and said on the body we want the color of the text to be white so that we can see it. And instead of paragraph text, maybe we have like an H1, welcome to my site, or something like that. And then, of course, we need to remove that margin because it's messing it up. And we'll come down here, give it some margin on the top, which will be 50 pixels. Actually, no, we don't want to do that. We want to do some padding on the top so that it doesn't bring the whole image down. And then maybe we'll say on the body that we want the text alignment to be center, so that's centered on the screen. So we have a welcome message, says welcome to my site, and you've got a nice background image. There's obviously a lot more that you can do here. I didn't even scratch the surface on all the different things you have to think about when you're putting together a background image and trying to actually get elements like this piece of text on top of it. So that gets a little bit more complicated, but hopefully this is just a nice overview of those background properties to see what's possible. All right, so the last thing I'm going to say about CSS properties is that there is a shorthand way to write them in some cases. So to this point, you've seen me just writing these properties and not really explaining, okay, I'm giving it a margin of 0 right here, but what does that represent? Is the 0 margin going to be a margin on the left, the right, top, bottom, all 4 of them? And the answer is it's going to be all 4 of them, because this margin property is a shorthand CSS property. And what you can do, let me go ahead and get us a better example here, because this is not a good example. So let's make a div and target that div, give it a width of 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and a background color of green, just so that we have something on the screen. And then from here, or actually let's make a couple of these so that we see 2 of them. And you can see that they're combined together because there's no margin. But if we were to put some margin on this, we can say the margin is just 20 pixels and be done with it. Or we could say that the margin top is going to be 20 pixels so that it doesn't space it from the left side of the screen. So this margin property, when it's defined just on its own, is a shorthand property. You can give it one value, which makes the margin on all sides equal, or you can come in here and you can give it 4 different values. So let me make sure I got this right. But the first value should be the top margin. Then you have looks like the right margin, then the bottom margin, and finally the left margin. So you can define different values for, top, right, bottom, left, instead of writing it all out like this. So we could say this line right here, I'll comment it out, and that's going to be equivalent to this. So we'll say margin top is 20, margin right is 5 pixels, margin bottom is 10 pixels, and margin left is 20 pixels. So these 4 properties combined together is the same exact thing as this one shorthand property. So you'll see this very commonly in CSS, where another great example of this is border. You could say border is 1 pixel solid black, and you'll see that border pop up, or not very well. Let's make it 5 pixels so you can see it better. And this is a shorthand property, so what we could have done is comment this out and say border size is 5 pixels, the border color is black, and then the border, I believe, style is solid. And it looks like I got something wrong here because the size is all messed up, but let's look it up in the documentation. So we'll type in border, and it says that it sets the values border width, border style, and border color. So that's what I missed. It's not border size, it would be border width. And now you'll see the same exact result as you saw. Let's go ahead and comment this out just so that I can prove this out. So we'll comment out those 3 properties and comment this one back in. And the shorthand property has the same exact effect. So shorthand properties are a really quick and easy way to write CSS. You'll kind of get used to them, and just wanted to let you know that that was going on, because I know it's kind of confusing when you see all of these different properties being written and nobody explains, oh, we can define the margin right using like 3 different ways of doing it. Congratulations if you've made it this far. I know it's been probably a couple hours at this point of me talking about CSS and properties and concepts, box models, all that kind of stuff. But hopefully that was a good introduction for you. And at this point, we're going to kind of prep ourselves for the HTML and CSS challenges that we looked at the beginning of the video. So I'll be walking you through those on video in separate videos, not this one. But before we get there, I want to introduce the 4-step method that I go through when I'm writing HTML and CSS, because it was not offered to me when I was first starting out, or I didn't find it on my own. And I think it would be really helpful to you because it took me a while to figure this out and really get into a good routine. So this is a systematic way to write CSS and HTML. And the first step is to figure out what you want to put on the page. And oftentimes that comes in the form of a design. Now, we talked about we're not going to go through wireframing or graphic design in this course. We're leveraging existing designs that have already been built, but that is a huge, huge concept here. You never want to go into it where you have no idea how you want to design the visual elements on the page and try to write the code and design it all at the same time. It's really confusing, and I've done it too many times, and I would not recommend it. Now, once you have the design, or at least some sort of wireframe that gives you a sense of where you want to put the elements, you have to think of step 2, which is how do I want to arrange those on the page with HTML. Now, this is a highly intuitive step. You're going to get a lot better at this with experience, and it's much easier after you've written a couple of apps to understand, oh, I need to put a div container here, and then I need 3 div containers within that main div container, and then within each of those containers I probably need some text and then maybe another container. So you'll get a lot better at realizing how to use divs and different semantic HTML elements on the page as you go along. The third step is how can I use CSS to achieve that outline or layout. And this is where all of the stuff we talked about in this crash course come into play. If you don't know some of these properties and how they work and how they disrupt the flow of the elements on the page, then you're not going to be able to do this very well. So like step number 2, you'll get a lot better with practice on this one. And then finally, step 4, I really think this is probably the easier step of this process, and that is how do I want to style these elements. So once you've got them laid out on the page, styling them is rather trivial. You're just putting different colors and some padding, maybe some margin, that kind of stuff on them, maybe some text decoration or font sizes, that kind of stuff. And it's pretty trivial compared to getting the layout correct in the first place. So to go through this process, I'm going to give you a short example here at the end of this video, and then make sure to keep it in mind as we go into the challenge videos, and I'll be sure to kind of adhere to this process as we're building those front-end Mentor code challenges. So here's what we're going to build with this 4-step method. We can think of this as the design. So let me go ahead and change the view so that it's very clear. So we're going to go to full page view, and you'll see the design that we're trying to make. It's nothing fancy, but just looking at that visual design, how can we lay that out in HTML? So we have to decide, looking at this, do we want some containers built out? It looks like they're next to each other. How do we accomplish that with HTML? So let's go back over to our playground and start writing this out. I'm going to actually put these side by side so that we can see them a little bit better. When I look at this design, the first thing that I see is 2 div elements. So I'm thinking I'm definitely going to have 2 divs, and usually when I put something together with HTML, I have a container div, so kind of like the overarching parent to all the elements. So what I'll do here is start us out with a template. We'll say div.container and press tab to make a div with a class of container. And then from here, I want to make a div with a class of box1, and then I want to make another div with a class of box2. So we've seen this before, so if you remember, you might be able to kind of figure this out. But this is the basic structure that I think I want to lay that out. And of course, there's 2 pieces of text. So in each of these divs, I'm going to put some sort of H2. We'll call that box1. And then we will say we want some text in there. And then we can just copy this down into box2. As you can see on the screen on the left, this looks nothing like the one on the right. And the reason I knew to put all of these HTML elements in this fashion is because I have experience doing it. And I just know that we have an overarching container. Each div is going to represent each box, and then there's content within each of these divs that we can, center and style a little bit later. So let's go back to our 4-step process here. We already asked how we want to arrange them. That's the design itself, so what we're looking at over on the right. We said, how does this arrangement look in the form of HTML? We already wrote that out. It doesn't look anything like it yet, but it will. And now we have to say, how do we use CSS to imagine that layout that we see on the right? So from here, we have to take CSS and get these boxes. I need to label this one correctly. We need to get these 2 boxes and put them next to each other. Now, what I'm most comfortable with is Flexbox. I know we haven't learned it, and that's going to be a separate video, but I'm going to go ahead and use it here just to give an example. And how you use that is you basically take the main container and you display that as a flex item. And what that's going to do is it's going to put the boxes right next to each other. Now what you have to do is for each of the boxes, we're going to give it a width, or no, we're not going to do that. We're going to give it a flex basis of 50%. And we'll give that also to box number 2. So flex is going to be 50%. That's basically going to make them equal to each other. And then we need to give them a border so that we can see what is going on. And I think it's about 2 pixels is what the border we're looking for is. So we've got the border here on box number 1. We can copy this down to box number 2. We want to make that one blue. Okay, and the next thing that we want to do is probably give some margin around it because currently they're right next to each other. So we'll give it a margin of, say, 20 pixels. And down here we will give it a margin of 20 pixels as well. Looks a little bit big, so let's reduce that to 10 on both of them. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. And then with the box 1 and box 2, we probably also need to do text align center so that the text is all centered. We're going to refactor this in just a second. So now we're centered, and at this point we're pretty much spot on with our layout. So we need to go to the last step, which is how should each element be styled. We already have a border, so that's kind of part of the process, but the only thing that we need to do really is give it a color of blue for the text on the right, and then give it a color of green for the text on the left. And there you go. We have a pretty similar layout. I think partially why it doesn't look exactly the same is because it's smaller, but maybe we gave this some different dimensions. But I'm happy with this. We accomplished kind of what we wanted here. The only thing that I would do is refactor this CSS because currently you can see we've set flex equal to 50% on both of these. We've also set the text align and the margin. So we can combine those into one selector. So put a comma there, select both boxes, and then get all of these common properties that apply to both of them in here. So we'll grab the margin and the flex basis. And then we go ahead and delete that from these properties or from these selectors. And it should look the same now. So this is how you would go through that 4-step process to solve an HTML and CSS challenge. In the next video, we're going to go through that basic design challenge. And let me see if I can pull it up right here. So we'll go to Frontend Mentor. And we'll go to challenges. I have to go to my profile actually. Go to my challenges, and we'll be doing this one right here. So let me expand that out. We'll just be doing this single price grid component, and then we'll move on to the Flexbox and CSS grid videos, do this design, and then finally cap it off with the crowdfunding product page, which is going to combine all of the lessons that we've had in this entire course so far into one and see what we can do. Once again, congrats if you've made it to the end of this video. Really hope you enjoyed it and got a nice big overview of CSS. Put a lot of work into this, and I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video, especially if you've made it this far. It doesn't hurt to go down there and click that thumbs up button. So thanks for watching again, and hit me up on Twitter with any questions, and I'll see you in the next lesson.